So yesterday we were talking about a machlokes in the Mishnah as to how many piles of wood are supposed to be on the Mizbeach on a regular basis. But everyone agrees that on Yom Kippur there's an extra pile of burning wood to create coals for the special ketoras that's offered on Yom Kippur. The most piles that's advocated is by Rabbi Meir. He says on a daily basis there were 4 piles of wood. There was what's called the Maracha Gedalia, the main large pile. Then there was an auxiliary pile for creating coals for the daily ketores. Then there was a backup pile, just in case the fire on the main pyre went out. And then the 4th pile, which is what we're going to be discussing shortly, is for burning Evarim Upedarim, fats and body parts that had, for whatever reason, not successfully burned throughout the night from the previous afternoon Ola. Okay, so, and then of course everyone agrees that there's an additional pile for Yom Kippur, which is for the special ketoris that's brought into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. We're now on the second line on DAF Mem Vav Amud Aleph. Amar Rabbi Elazar Mishum Bar Kapara. We're going to see the statement of Bar Kapara, which is going to be the subject of some analysis, because it seems like Bar Kapara is saying something that's unnecessary. Omer Haya Rabbi Meir, Evare Ola Shenitosru, Osalehen Maracha Bifnei Atzma V'Sodran, Va'afilu B'Shabbos. That according to Rabbi Meir, if there are any leftover limbs from the yesterday's Korban Ola, there should be a separate pile of wood on the Mizbeach that you use to burn those body parts. And that's true even on Shabbos. So the Gemara asks the question, Mai Kamash Malan, what is Bar Kapara coming to teach? So the Gemara actually is going to bisect Bar Kapara's statement into 2 parts. First, we're going to analyze the first part, which seems to be completely redundant, because we already learned in the Mishnah and the Brisa yesterday that Reb Meir holds you have to have 4 piles of wood, and one of those 4 piles is for the pile of burning the leftover body parts. Tanina b'chol yom hayusham arba marachos. Every day there were 4 piles. So why does Bar Kapara have to repeat that? If Bar Kapara is an Amora, why does he have to say something that's already explicit in the Mishnah? Amar Rabbi Abin lo nitzracha ela lepsulin. That answers Rabbi Abin. Bar Kapara's chiddush is as follows. Not only do you continue burning body parts of a kosher korban, but even a non-kosher korban. Now, what do we mean by a non-kosher korban? Well, without going into too much detail, we learned in Maseches Zvachim and in other places that there are certain situations where lechatchila you're not allowed to put an animal on the mizbeach. It has a certain kind of mum, which makes it not kosher as a korban. However, the Mishnah says, Im alu lo yerdu. If you do put them on, don't remove them. Okay? Now, what would happen if a korban that only was put on b'diavad as kosher, meaning that it was not supposed to be put on, but you put it on, and that korban was burning through the night, and one of the body parts popped off, and now you have a leftover body part? Do you continue burning that on the 4th pile? Answers Bar Kapara, yes. That's the chiddush of Bar Kapara, not only when it was a completely kosher korban, but even when it was not a kosher korban. And then he said, but then Rabbi Abin says, V'davka shemashla bahen ha'or, avalo mashla bahen ha'or lo. But that's only true if that body part from that puzzle korban had already been ignited somewhat. It had been singed already. But if it had not yet been ignited at all, so then you would not be allowed to add it to the 4th pile. Ika da Amri, others learn, Echad Kesherin Vechad Pesulin, Imash Labahen Ha'or in V'ilolo. Some say that that's true for both kosher karbanos and non-kosher karbanos. In other words, even a korban that's kosher lechatchila, and it burns through the night and one piece flies off and doesn't burn. The only time that you add it to this 4th pile is only when it had been somewhat ignited, somewhat singed. But if it had not yet been affected at all by fire, then even Reb Meir would agree that you do not add that to the 4th pile. Now, the next part of Bar Kapara's statement was Va'afilu b'Shabbos, that you're supposed to do this even on Shabbos, which means that if you have a body part from a korban from, let's say, Friday afternoon, and it was supposed to burn through the night and one of the pieces did not, then you can add it to the fire even on Shabbos. Even though normally Shabbos is a time when we only allow you to bring korbanos for that day, but Bar Kapara says that this is true even on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, but that statement of Bar Kapara is also superfluous, because Tanina, V'hayom Chamesh. Well, we learned in the Mishnah and in the Brisa that on Yom Kippur you have to have 5 piles. Now let's think about this for a second. Yom Kippur has the same status of Shabbos. Whatever's forbidden on Shabbos is forbidden on Yom Kippur. If on Yom Kippur you're supposed to have 5 piles of wood, that means that one of the 5 piles is a pile for leftover Eivarim U'Pedarim, is leftover for limbs that were burning the previous day. So clearly from the Mishnah itself, you already see that you can take a carbon that was from yesterday and have it continue burning on Shabbos. So why did you need Bar Kapara's statement of Va'afilu b'Shabbos? That's already implicit in the Mishnah. The Gemara answers, Rav Acha bar Yaakov itzterich, Salka daita chamina hanimili heicha dechal Yom Kippurim lios achar haShabbos dechal veShabbos kraven b'Yom Kippurim, aval be'emsa Shabbos lo kamash malan. I'll tell you why, says the Gemara. If you only had that statement that you have 5 piles on Yom Kippur, I might have thought that you're only allowed to have 5 piles on Yom Kippur when Yom Kippur falls out on a Sunday. In that situation, when you have a leftover limb, that leftover limb was from yesterday, which was a Shabbos carbon. Maybe the only time that you're allowed to continue burning on Yom Kippur something from yesterday is when yesterday's carbon was a Shabbos carbon. Since there was already a heter to burn that thing on a day which is a Sabbath, only then are you allowed to continue burning it on Yom Kippur, which is also a Sabbath. But perhaps if Yom Kippur fell out on a Tuesday, for example, and there was a leftover body part from a Monday weekday korban, maybe the halacha would be that you're not allowed to burn that on Yom Kippur. So therefore, Bar Kapara has to spell it out, and he has to tell you, no, even on a regular Shabbos, where Friday is a weekday, if you have a leftover body part from Friday's korban tamid, you're allowed to continue burning it on Shabbos. So the Gemara now says, Amar Rava, man hai de lo chayish lekimche. Rava is critical of that statement. He says, who is this person who's not careful about grinding his flour? Now, what does that statement mean? Rashi in Maseches Sukkah explains that what this means is that when you grind flour, when you grind wheat into flour, you have to be very careful to separate all the different parts and the grades of the wheat. You have to separate the chaff. You have to separate the bran. You have to separate the undesirable in order to get fine flour. A person who's reckless in the way that he grinds wheat into flour will have poor quality flour. Similarly, a person who's not careful about selecting his words and sifting through his words carefully is going to end up with a bad quality statement. And Rava is therefore critical. You're telling me that Bar Kapara's statement was necessary in order to clarify that even on a regular Shabbos you can burn a leftover body part from Friday? Habechol Yom Tanan. That is not true, because it says in the Mishnah explicitly that every single day there were 4 piles. If the Mishnah says explicitly that every single day there were 4 piles, it means even on Shabbos. And therefore, Bar Kapara's statement is completely superfluous, regardless of your argument that you wouldn't have necessarily known it. No, it's clear. And therefore, the Gemara says, Kasha. You're right, that's a problem. We're left with the problem as why Bar Kapara had to make that last statement of Va'afilu b'Shabbos. It seems to be completely redundant, says Rava. Now, the Gemara now makes the next statement, which is that both according to Bar Kapara and according to Rava, if you have a leftover body part from Friday, you can continue burning it into Shabbos. The Gemara says, Upliga de Rav Huna, but Rav Huna disagrees. Rav Huna disagrees. In other words, how's Rav Huna going to learn the Mishnah? Maybe he doesn't hold like Rabbi Meir Bichlal, right? So therefore, he doesn't have to commit to Rabbi Meir Shita. But the point is that Rav Huna holds that if you have a body part that was from a weekday korban, you cannot continue burning it into Shabbos. And where do we see this? The Amar Tchilasa Dofes Sofo Eino Doche, because Rav Huna says that the beginning stage pushes off, but the end stage does not push off. Now, what do we mean by that? As what the Gemara says, what this means contextually is that if you have a korban that you're allowed to bring on Shabbos at the initial stages of that korban, then you're allowed to push off Shabbos. You're allowed to override Shabbos to do the initial stages of a korban. But if you've already done the initial stages of a korban and then Shabbos arrives, you're not allowed to continue with that korban. Okay? So basically what Rav Huna is teaching me is that if I started bringing a korban on Friday, and then I have to continue the process because I haven't finished it yet, and Shabbos arrives, I have to stop. I'm not allowed to burn.
Do I have to remove them?
No, you don't have to remove it. Right? You don't have to remove it, but you're not allowed to do anything active. Just like if you put up a pot of food before Shabbos, you don't have to remove the pot. but you can't actively violate Shabbos in order to continue the sacrificial process. So the Gemara now says Gufa. Let's analyze Rav Huna's statement. The way we've just interpreted Rav Huna is the way I just explained it to you, that his statement is a statement of Shabbos. But if you look carefully in Rav Huna's words, he doesn't say anything about Shabbos. He just says the first stage of the carbon pushes off, the second stage of the carbon does not push off. Now we had interpreted it contextually to mean that it pushes off Shabbos, and the second stage or the later stage does not push off Shabbos. But this is going to be actually a machlokus as to what Rav Huna means.
You mean put on the side?
No, push off means to override, to take priority. No, not to physically. No, I'm not physically pushing. Takes priority. Okay? Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, Tamid chilaso doches sofein doches. Let's go to that statement. The carbon tamid, at the first stage of the carbon tamid, it overrides. The second part of the carbon tamid does not override. My enodocha. What is it that it does not override? So Rav Chisda Amar doche es haShabbos ve'enodoche es hatuma. So Rav Chisda learns it differently from what I had just explained a moment ago. Rav Chisda says that when it comes to the laws of tuma, a carbon can override the laws of tuma only at the initial stages, but it does not override tuma in its secondary stages. Now what that means is as follows. Normally we know that tuma is suspended when everyone is tameh. But let's say at the beginning stage of the carbon, everyone was tameh except one kohen. Okay? So this kohen, we'll call him Aaron. Aaron was the only kohen available to offer this carbon. Fantastic. He starts the carbon process. He does the zrikas hadam. He does the sprinkling of the blood. Everything's going great. And all of a sudden, the last standing kohen now becomes tameh. Aaron now becomes tameh before he's had a chance to burn all the animal parts on the mizbeach. So that, Rav Chisda says, is what Rav Huna means. That because it's only now the latter stages of the carbon, the tuma cannot be overridden because you've already done the first part. And the first part is arguably the more important part. As we'll see momentarily, the first part is the Zrikas Hadam. Zrikas Hadam is the trigger that achieves the objective of the carbon. Once you do the Zrika, you've achieved the kapara. You've completed the objective, okay? And therefore, Tumah cannot be overridden if it's just coming to do the second stages of the carbon. But Shabbos, says Rav Chisda, even the second stages of the carbon override Shabbos. But Virabba Amar doche es hatuma ve'eno doche es haShabbos. But Rabbi says, I hold just the opposite. What Rav Huna means to say is that the second stages of a carbon override tuma, but the second stages of a carbon do not override Shabbos. That's the way you and I had learned it just a moment ago. Now, Amar le Abaya l'Rabba l'didach kasha u'l'Rav Chisda kasha. So Abaya says, I don't understand either you or Rav Chisda. You don't make any sense. According to Rav Chisda, the second stages of the carbon override Shabbos, but they don't override Tumah. According to you, the second stages of the carbon override Tumah, but they don't. They override Shabbos, but they don't override. They override Tumah, but they don't override Shabbos. Both of you are problematic. Why? L'didach kasha ma'ishna Tumah dichsif b'mo'ado v'afilu b'Tumah Shabbos nami b'mo'ado v'afilu b'Shabbos. According to you, Rabbi, I don't understand what kind of distinction are you making. What's the reason why you believe that the second stages of a carbon override Tumah? Because the Torah says this is the carbon that you must bring at its allotted time. So therefore, regardless of whether there's Tumah or not, you must continue and commence with the carbon. Well, by that argument, you should say the same word b'mo'ado to tell me that the second stages of the carbon override Shabbos as well. And Rav Chisda kasha ma'ishna Shabbos tichsiv b'mo'ado afilu b'Shabbos tumanami b'mo'ado v'afilu b'Tumah. And Rav Chisda will ask the question just the opposite. If according to Rav Chisda, what's the reason why a carbon overrides, second stages of a carbon override Shabbos? Because the Torah says b'mo'ado, unconditionally complete the carbon at its allotted time. Well, if that's and that's true even on Shabbos. Well, if that's the case, then it should override Tumah using the same pasuk of b'mo'ado. So Amar Le. So Rabbi responds to Abai and he says, Lo l'didi kasha, v'lo l'Rav Chisda kasha. He says, no. Let me explain to you. It's not a problem for me, and it's not a problem for Rav Chisda. L'didi lo kasha. Let me explain to you why I hold that the second stages of the carbon only override Tumah, but they don't override Shabbos. Let me explain to you why. Sofo kitichilaso. So he says, because I hold that the end stage of a carbon, the secondary stage of a carbon, has the same halachic status as the initial stage of the carbon. And the way I look at it is like this. Tuma de tchilaso bar mitcha tumahu. Sofo nami dachi. So he says like this. He says, when it comes to tuma, at the initial stages of this carbon tamid that's supposed to be brought on Friday, if there is no one available to bring the carbon in a state of tahara, then you have a heter to bring this carbon in a state of tumah. That's at the initial stages of the carbon. So therefore, since I have the right to bring the initial stages of the carbon in a state of tumah, then I have a right to bring the secondary carbon state. I can finish the carbon in a state of tumah as well. But, however, that's by contrast Shabbos. Shabbos, the tchilaso lav bar mitcha Shabbosu, sofonami lo dachi. But when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, if I have a carbon tamid that I'm supposed to bring on Friday, do I have a heter to violate Shabbos in order to bring the carbon tamid of Friday? Of course not. Right? So if I don't have a heter to violate Shabbos in order to bring the carbon tamid of Friday, then the second stage of the carbon tamid of Friday cannot violate Shabbos either. So basically, says Rabbi, that's my opinion. My opinion is that that's why Tumah and Shabbos are fundamentally different. For Tumah, since you have a heter to override Tumah at the initial stages, you have a heter to override Tumah in the secondary stages. But for Shabbos, since you don't have a heter to override Shabbos at the initial stages of this carbon, you therefore, if there's any remnant of this carbon that leads into Shabbos, you don't have a right to violate Shabbos for it as well. Okay, so that's the difference. And that's why I hold that we're more liberal to override Tumah than to override Shabbos. And the Rav Chisda lo kasha, and Rav Chisda also is not problematic because he looks at it total just the other way. He says sofo kitchilaso lesle. He doesn't hold of that svara that the heter at the beginning determines the heter at the end. That's not his thought process. But rather he holds as follows. Shabbos dehutra he bitzibor sofo nami dachi. Tuma de dechuya he bitzibor tchilaso deikar kapara dachi sofo de lavikar kapara lo dachi. Now, if you recall, just to explain this Gemara, we had a discussion a number of places, whether, especially in Maseches Psachim, whether Tuma is Hutra B'tzibor or it's Dechuya B'tzibor. Is Tuma completely removed when there are communal carbon considerations, or is it pushed aside with great difficulty when there are Tuma considerations? So Rav Chisda holds that it's only with great difficulty that the Torah allows you to push aside Tumah when there's a communal carbon that needs to be brought. Okay, now based upon this, he says this is the difference between Shabbos and Tumah. We know that the laws of Shabbos are completely removed. In other words, when it comes to bringing a carbon on Shabbos, it's ois Shabbos. There's no laws of Shabbos whatsoever that you have to be concerned with, and therefore we're much more liberal as far as suspending the rules of Shabbos to bring a carbon than we are suspending the rules of Tumah to bring a carbon. And it's based on that, says Rav Chisda, that when you have the remnant of Friday's carbon that is not yet burned, since you see that we're much more liberal as far as pushing away Shabbos in order to let you do a carbon than we are to pushing away Tumah, we allow you to conclude burning the carbon, Friday's carbon, into Shabbos. That's what Rav Chisda says. But when it comes to Tumah, since Tumah is only Dechuya B'tzibur, since it's only with great difficulty alleviated, in order to allow you to bring a communal carbon, we only allow you to push away Tumah for the initial stages of the carbon, which is the primary objective of the carbon being fulfilled. But when it comes to the secondary stages of the carbon, after the blood has been already sprinkled, since that's not vital to the objective of the carbon being met, we don't allow you to push off Tumah, because Tumah is much harder to push aside for the sake of a carbon than Shabbos is. So that's Rav Chisda's svar. Now Itmar. Now we go on to a related discussion. Hamachabe eish machta umenorah. Remember we learned yesterday that you take a lot of different fuel sources off of the Mizbeach HaChitzon, off of the outer altar, in order to ignite different things. So on Yom Kippur, you're going to take your shovel full of coals off of the outer Mizbeach, and you're going to transport those coals with you into the Holy of Holies, and you're going to add the incense over the coals in the Holy of Holies. Remember we learned that?
Yeah.
Okay. We also learned yesterday that the fuel source for lighting the menorah also comes from the coals that are burning on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Okay? So you take your coals off the Mizbeach HaChitzon, you transport a coal or coals over to the menorah, and that's how you light the menorah on a daily basis. Now what would happen if a person takes a shovel full of coals for the purpose of the ketores or for the purpose of lighting the menorah, and before he's had a chance to do the mitzvah, he extinguishes the coal? What would be the halacha? So Abaya Amar Chayev, Rava Amar Pater. Abaya says you're in violation of the biblical law because the Torah says Eish Tamid Tukar al HaMizbeach Lo Sichbeh. You have to burn constantly on the Mizbeach, do not extinguish. If you do extinguish, says Abaya, you did a mitzvah lo saseh. You extinguished a coal from the Mizbeach. And Rava says you're not in violation. So now the Gemara says, let's clarify this machlokas. Berosho shel Mizbeach tu kuli alma lo pligi dechayev. Everyone agrees that if you extinguish the coal before you descend from off the Mizbeach, then both Abaya and Rava would agree that you're in violation because you've got a coal mamish on the Mizbeach and you're extinguishing it. Ki pligi da'achte ha'ara v'kabyeh. The machlokas is when you remove it off of the Mizbeach, descend down to the ground, and then you extinguish it. Abaya Amar Chayev, Eish HaMizbeachu, Rava Amar Pater, Kiven Denaska Naska. Abaya says, listen, it's still a fire from the Mizbeach, and therefore you're liable. But Rava says, no, you removed it off of the Mizbeach. Once it's removed off of the Mizbeach, and it's on the ground, it's not considered to be a fire of the altar anymore, and therefore, if you extinguish it, you haven't violated the Torah. Elahada Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua Hamorid Gacheles Me'al Gabi HaMizbeach V'Kiba Chayiv Keman Ke'Abaya. So the Gemara says, based on the way you're explaining the machlokes, Rav Nachman's statement, which is that if a person takes a coal off of the Mizbeach and goes down to the ground and extinguishes, he's liable. That statement of Rav Nachman can only go according to Abaya, not according to Rava, because according to Rava, you're not in violation. The Gemara says, no, afilu tema karava hasam lo intak lemitzvasa hacha intika lemitzvasa. The Gemara says, no, not necessarily. It could be that even Rava would agree that you're liable in that case. The only time that Rava says that you're not liable is when you did what? When you removed the coal and brought it to the ground for the purpose of the mitzvah. Since you took the coal off of the Mizbeach for the purpose of the mitzvah, this is not called a Mizbeach coal anymore. It's called a menorah coal, or it's called a ketoris coal. And therefore you're not in violation. But if you gratuitously remove the coal for absolutely no reason at all, for no mitzvah purpose, you removed the coal off of the Mizbeach and then extinguished it, Rava would also agree that you'd be liable even after you take it off the Mizbeach and it's on the ground. Ika da Amri, others say that the machlokus of Abai and Rav is as follows. That everyone, both Abai and Rava, would agree that if you take the coal off of the Mizbeach, put it to the ground, and then extinguish it, both Abai and Rava would agree that you're pater. Ki pligi dekavi barosha shel Mizbeach, Abai Amar Chayev, Eish HaMizbeachu, Rava Amar Pater, ki b'denaska naska. The machlokus is when you remove the coal off of the pile in the center of the Mizbeach, and then you extinguish it before you descend off of the Mizbeach. Abaya says you're chayiv because it's a fire of the altar, and Rabbi says you're pater since you picked it up off of the Mizbeach floor. It's no longer a fire on the Mizbeach, even though you're standing on top of the Mizbeach still, but you've removed it, and therefore you're going to be pater. So now the Gemara says, no, wait a minute. The way you're explaining the machlokas now, everyone agrees that if you descend off of the Mizbeach and you bring the coal to the floor, so then everyone would agree that if you extinguish it, then you're pater. So Elahad Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua Hamorid Gacheles Me'al Gabi HaMizbeach V'Kava Chayiv Kaman Lo Ke'Abai V'Lo Ke'Rava. So then Rav Nachman's statement then goes according to neither Abai and Rava, because Rav Nachman says if you take the coal and bring it to the floor and you extinguish it, you're chayiv. The way you've just explained the machlokas, both Abai and Rav agree that you're patur. So how do you reconcile that? So the Gemara says, Hasam lo intik lemitzvasa, hacha intik lemitzvasa. So the Gemara says it's apples and oranges. Abai and Rav are only talking about a case where you pick up the coal for the purpose of doing a mitzvah, either to light the menorah or to burn the ketoris. That's where you have an issue. That's where everyone says that you're putter when you bring it down to the floor. Because why? Because since it's been removed from the mizbeach for a mitzvah purpose, it's now called the coal for mitzvah. It's not called the coal for the mizbeach. But if you remove it gratuitously and you take it off the mizbeach and put it down to the floor for no mitzvah purpose, then everyone would agree, like Rav Nachman says, that you're chayv because it's still called the fire of the mizbeach because it hasn't been removed for any mitzvah purpose. Hadron alach taraf bekalfi. Let's go start the next mission. Because I don't know, if you got to run somewhere, you got to run. But we got plenty of time, and doesn't seem to be much to do today.
If you have wanted to do something with this coal, but it just happens to drop for a minute, and it's confident that you're going to go further with it, does that dropping do anything?
What do you mean, does it drop? You mean you did it b'shogeg instead of b'mezid?
Just drop.
It could be that, yes, so b'shogeg you violated a mitzvah lo saseh. But since it's b'shogeg, there's no kapara for a mitzvah lo saseh. Okay. Hotziu lo es hakaf es hamachta. Now let's recall where we are in this stage, in our avoda stage. We just got through saying that the Kohen Gadol has taken a shovelful or a pan full of coals off of the Mizbeach in this very fine golden container, and now he's going to bring it, and he's going to bring it with him into the Kodesh HaKadoshim together with Ketores, and he's going to pour the Ketores into the coal pan in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Now, do you remember? You remember we learned about the early Christians, that this was the argument that they had with the rabbinic community? The rabbi said that you can only combine the Ketores with the coals only when you're inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Whereas the Tzedukim, or the early Minim, they said that you combine it already outside the Kodesh HaKadoshim and then walk in with a cloud wafting off of the pan. So remember, the Kohen Gadol is going to have to walk into the Beis HaMikdash with coals, with incense separately in two different containers, and then he's going to have to pour the incense into the coals only after he's inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So now our parak is going to continue this discussion, and we're going to see how he does this. Hotziu lo es hakaf ve'es hamachta. We produce for the Kohen Gadol the ladle, or a spoon, a big spoon, and a machta, and a shovel, or a pan. A machta is either a shovel or a pan, but it's a pan. We had said before that this machta was holding the coals, but this seems to be like a different machta. This seems to be something else. But we'll see. It seems to be a pan that is holding incense. As you'll see, we'll clarify that in just a second. Chafan below chafnav v'nasan l'soch hakaf. The Kohen Gadol then takes his two hands. He sticks it into the pan containing the incense, pulls out two big fistfuls of incense, and puts those fistfuls of incense into the ladle. Okay? And the Mishnah clarifies hagadol lefi gadlo v'hakatan lefi ktano, that it all depends upon the size of the Kohen Gadol's hands. If he's a big Kohen Gadol, so then he's got a large measure of incense. If he's a small Kohen Gadol, he's got kleina hands, so those hands, the measure will be smaller. And v'kacha isamidasa, that was what its measure was every year. Okay? And natal es hamachta biyamino ve'es hakaf bismalo. He then took the pan, and here the pan is different from the pan in the first part of the Mishnah. This pan is now the pan full of coals. And he takes that in his right hand, and he takes the ladle that has the incense in it with his left hand. Now, the way I've just explained to you the Mishnah is not clear to the Gemara. The Gemara is going to clarify that, as you'll see in just a second. Machta, what are you talking about a pan? Why are you introducing a new pan? Hatanale, we already learned about the pan that he uses to shovel up coals from the Mizbeach. Because it said, Natales hamachta v'ala l'rosh hamizbeach v'chosa v'yored. We already learned in the previous Mishnah that the Kohen takes a pan made out of gold, he goes to the top of the outer altar, he shovels up a bunch of coals, and then he comes off the Mizbeach. Why are you then introducing a new pan in our Mishnah? The Gemara says, Hasa machta de gecholim, behachta machta de ketores. The answer is that there are two machtos. There's a pan that he uses that was the fine gold that we learned in the previous Mishnah, that he uses to shovel up coals from off of the Mizbeach. And the pan that we're talking about here is a pan that was holding the Ketores, which the Kohen Gadol would then dip both hands into and pull out 2 fistfuls of Ketores. The Tanya, as the Brisa clarifies, Hotziulo es hakaf rekan milishkas hakelim. Where did the Kohen Gadol get the ladle from? He got it from a chamber in the Beis HaMikdash called the Chamber of Utensils. They took it, they produced for him an empty ladle from the utensil chamber. Umachta gedusha shel ketores milishkas Beis Avtinas. And then they took out a machta, a pan, from the chamber of Beis Avtinas. Now remember, who was Beis Avtinas? Beis Avtinas was the family that was in charge of manufacturing the ketores. So they had a special chamber in the temple where they would manufacture the ketores, and they had pans in there. And once they finished manufacturing the ketores, they put the ketores in this big heaping, they put it in a pan, and the ketores was heaping over the top. And that's what they took out of the chamber and presented it to the Kohen Gadol, and that's what our Mishnah is talking about. It's talking about the machta of ketores. He dips his 2 hands in, pulls out 2 fistfuls of ketores, and then he's going to put that into the kaf, into the ladle, which is a smaller container than obviously this machta, than this pan, right? And then he's going to pick up the pan that's filled with coals from the previous Mishnah, carry that in his right hand, carry the ladle in his left hand, and then the suspense builds. We'll see what he does with them as he enters into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. You have a wonderful day.